The desert night is alive with sound, not the silence that most people imagine when they think of the southwestern borderlands, but a symphony of subtle noises that only those who work these lonely stretches truly understand. The whisper of wind through creosote bushes, the distant cry of a coyote, the soft crunch of boots on sand and gravel. And on this particular night in March of 2014, something else entirely, something that would challenge everything that veteran Border Patrol agent James Ramirez thought he understood about the world. The stretch of border between Douglas, Arizona, and Agua Prieta, Mexico is unforgiving terrain. During the day, temperatures can soar above 100 degrees, turning the landscape into a shimmering mirage of heat and dust. At night, the temperature plummets, and the darkness becomes absolute in a way that city dwellers can barely comprehend. There are no streetlights out here, no ambient glow from nearby towns, just the stars, impossibly bright and impossibly numerous, scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. This is where Agent Ramirez had spent the better part of 15 years, patrolling the invisible line that separates to nations, to cultures, to worlds. On this night, Ramirez was working the graveyard shift, as he often did. He preferred these hours, when the desert belonged to those who understood it, when the chaos of the daylight crossings gave way to a different kind of vigilance. He was stationed at a high point, overlooking a valley known locally as San Bernardino, a corridor that had seen more than its fair share of illegal crossings over the years. His vehicle was parked on a dirt road, engine off, windows down, allowing him to hear everything that moved in the darkness below. This was how you did the job properly, he believed, not with fancy technology, though that had its place, but with patience, experience, and an intimate knowledge of the land. It was approximately 2:30 in the morning when he first noticed them dot lights. Not the steady beam of flashlights that smugglers sometimes used, not the distant glow of vehicle headlights on the Mexican side. These were different. They appeared suddenly, without warning, roughly 300 yards to his south, just across the border. At first, there were 3 of them, amber-colored orbs that seemed to hover about 15 feet above the ground. They pulsed gently, their luminescence neither harsh nor dim, but somewhere perfectly in between. Ramirez reached for his night vision goggles, standard equipment for agents working the overnight hours, and trained them on the lights. What he saw made no sense. Through the enhanced vision of the goggles, the lights appeared even more distinct, but there was no source for them. No vehicles, no people holding lanterns, no structure that could be generating the glow. They simply existed, suspended in the air as if held by invisible hands. Ramirez had seen many strange things. During his years on the border, he had encountered desperate migrants, dangerous criminals, and all manner of wildlife. He had witnessed dust devils that seemed to possess intelligence, moving in patterns that defied meteorology, but this was something entirely new. He grabbed his radio, pressing the transmit button with fingers that had suddenly become less steady than he would have liked. His voice, when it came, was calm and professional, years of training overriding the uncertainty that was beginning to creep into his thoughts. He reported what he was seeing to the sector command, describing the lights in precise terms, giving their exact location based on the GPS coordinates displayed on his dashboard screen. The response came back quickly. Agent Maria Delgado, stationed approximately 2 miles to his east, confirmed that she could also see the lights from her position. A third agent, whose name Ramirez later learned was Thomas Chen, radioed in from the west. He'd had visual confirmation, 3 trained observers, positioned at different vantage points, all seeing the same phenomenon. This eliminated the possibility of an optical illusion, at least the kind that could be attributed to a single person's misperception. Whatever these lights were, they were physically present in the airspace above the border, visible from multiple angles. Command instructed all 3 agents to maintain observation and document everything they could. Ramirez pulled out his personal smartphone, knowing that the official equipment in his vehicle included a camera, but wanting a backup. He began recording video, narrating what he was seeing in a steady voice that betrayed none of the growing unease he felt. And then the lights began to move, not in the way that aircraft move, following predictable trajectories dictated by physics and aerodynamics, not in the way that drones move, with a slight mechanical jerkiness that betrays their technological nature. These lights moved with fluid grace, accelerating and stopping instantaneously, changing direction without any visible means of propulsion. They drifted eastward at first, moving at what Ramirez estimated to be about 10 miles per hour, maintaining their formation with geometric precision. Then, without warning, they stopped completely. impossibly, hanging motionless in the air as if someone had pressed a pause button on reality itself. The wind had been blowing steadily from the southwest all evening, a typical pattern for this region during the spring months. Ramirez could feel it against his face, carrying with it the scent of desert sage and distant rain that would never quite reach this parched land. Any normal airborne object, whether balloon, lantern, or lightweight drone, should have been pushed by this wind, carried along in its current like leaves in a stream. But these lights remained stationary, completely unaffected by the atmospheric conditions around them. It was as if they existed in a separate reality, one where the normal rules of physics held no authority. Agent Delgado's voice crackled over the radio, tainted with an emotion that Ramirez had never heard from her before. She was a veteran like himself, someone who had seen more than her share of strange and dangerous situations, but now she sounded uncertain, almost frightened. She reported that from her vantage point, the lights had suddenly increased in number. Where there had been 3, now there were 7. They had arranged themselves in a pattern that resembled a perfect arc, each light equidistant from its neighbors, creating a formation that was too precise to be accidental. Ramirez swung his night vision goggles back toward the phenomenon and confirmed what Delgado had reported. 7 lights now hung in the desert air, their amber glow pulsing in perfect synchronization, like the breathing of some vast organism. He zoomed in with his smartphone camera, the digital zoom grainy but serviceable, capturing footage that would later be analyzed by experts from multiple agencies. As he watched, one of the lights detached from the formation and began moving directly toward his position. His first instinct was to retreat, to start his vehicle and put distance between himself and whatever this thing was. But training overrode instinct. He was a federal agent responsible for monitoring this sector, and fleeing from an unknown phenomenon was not an option unless it presented a clear and immediate threat. So he remained in place, watching as the light approached, moving with that same impossible fluidity, covering ground at a speed that seemed to vary randomly, sometimes slow as a walking pace, sometimes fast as a sprinting cheetah. When the light was approximately 50 yards away, it stopped again. Ramirez could now see details that had not been visible at a distance. The light was not uniform. It seemed to have depth, layers of luminescence that shifted and swirled within the amber glow like cream stirred into coffee. There were no hard edges, no defined boundaries, just a gradual fade from brightness to darkness. And there was absolutely no sound. In the profound silence of the desert night, the complete absence of noise from this object was almost as unsettling as its presence. He tried to estimate its size, perhaps 3 feet in diameter, though it was difficult to be certain when dealing with a light source rather than a solid object. It hovered there, seemingly observing him as much as he was observing it, and for a long moment, nothing happened. Ramirez became acutely aware of his own heartbeat, loud in his ears, and the shallow quality of his breathing. He was not a man easily frightened, but he was experiencing something that his brain could not categorize, could not fit into any existing framework of understanding, and that fundamental uncertainty triggered responses that went deeper than conscious thought. Then, as suddenly as it had approached, the light retreated. It moved backward, maintaining the same distance it had traveled forward. Rejoining the formation with its 6 companions, the arc of lights began to rotate, slowly at first, then with increasing speed, maintaining their perfect geometric relationship as they spun. Ramirez watched through his night vision goggles, trying to make sense of what he was witnessing. The rotation created a kind of disc shape, the individual lights blurring together into a solid ring of amber luminescence. And then, without any warning or transition, they simply vanished, not fading away gradually, not moving off into the distance, but disappearing instantaneously, as if someone had flipped a switch. The desert was dark again. The stars continued their eternal vigil overhead. The wind still blew from the southwest, rustling through the sparse vegetation. Everything was exactly as it had been before the lights appeared, except for the 3 border patrol agents who had witnessed something that would haunt them for the rest of their careers. Command requested that all 3 agents return to the sector headquarters in Douglas for immediate debriefing. The drive back seemed longer than usual to Ramirez, his mind racing through possible explanations, each one more unsatisfying than the last. Could they have been some kind of advanced drone technology? Possible, but the movements defied any propulsion system he was aware of, and the complete silence made no sense if engines or rotors were involved. Could they have been some natural phenomenon, perhaps ball lightning or some other atmospheric anomaly? He had read about ball lightning, knew that it was poorly understood and sometimes exhibited strange behavior, but this had lasted too long. Moved to purposefully, and ball lightning was associated with thunderstorms, of which there were none in the area that night. At headquarters, the three agents were separated and interviewed individually, standard procedure to prevent their accounts from influencing each other. Ramirez sat in a small conference room with two supervisors and recounted everything he had observed, knowing even as he spoke how improbable it all sounded. But when they showed him the footage from his phone, the reality of the experience was confirmed. The video was grainy, the lights appearing as bright spots that bloomed slightly in the camera sensor. But they were there, moving exactly as he had described. Agent Delgado's footage, shot from a different angle, corroborated his account perfectly. Agent Chen's video showed the same phenomenon from yet another perspective, 3 independent recordings, all showing the same impossible thing. The incident was officially logged, assigned a case number, and forwarded up the chain of command. Ramirez assumed that would be the end of it, that the footage would be filed away in some database and eventually forgotten. But 3 days later, he was contacted by investigators from an agency whose exact affiliation was never made entirely clear to him. They wore civilian clothes but carried federal credentials. They asked him to recount his experience again, this time in even greater detail, asking questions about atmospheric conditions, nearby military installations, any unusual radio frequency interference he might have noticed, whether his equipment had malfunctioned in any way. He answered as honestly as he could, but the truth was that beyond what he had already reported, there wasn't much more to tell. The lights had appeared, moved in ways that seemed to violate known physics, and then vanished. The investigators listened impassively, took notes on tablets, and thanked him for his cooperation. Before they left, one of them mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that this was not the first such report from the border region. There had been others, stretching back decades, all sharing similar characteristics: lights that moved against the wind, objects that accelerated, impossibly, phenomena that defied ready explanation. Over the following weeks, Ramirez did his own research. He discovered that the Arizona-Mexico border region had a long history of unusual aerial phenomena. Local residents, both on the American and Mexican sides, had reported strange lights for generations. Some attributed them to secret military experiments, pointing to the proximity of Fort Huachuca and other defense installations. Others suggested natural explanations, such as electrical discharges from the copper-rich mountains or unusual atmospheric refraction, effects caused by temperature inversions in the desert. Still others embraced more exotic theories, speaking of extraterrestrial visitation, interdimensional portals, or ancient spirits that guarded the borderlands. What struck Ramirez most forcefully was the consistency of the reports. Different witnesses, separated by years or even decades, described essentially the same thing: amber or orange lights, hovering or moving with seemingly intelligent purpose, unaffected by wind, completely silent. Some reports included additional details: lights that seemed to respond to observers, formations that changed shape, sudden disappearances without any natural transition. The skeptic in him wanted to dismiss these accounts as misidentification, hysteria, or fabrication. But having experienced the phenomenon himself, having it documented on video from multiple angles, he could no longer maintain that comfortable skepticism. He spoke with other Border Patrol agents, carefully broaching the subject, and was surprised by how many had their own stories. An agent who had worked the border near Nogales described lights that had paced his vehicle for several miles before vanishing. Another recounted seeing a formation of 9 lights that had arranged themselves in a perfect grid pattern over the Huachuca Mountains. A retired agent, now in his 70s, spoke of an encounter in 1987 when lights had descended to within 20 feet of his patrol truck, close enough that he could feel heat radiating from them, though his vehicle's exterior showed no signs of scorching when examined later. These were not unreliable witnesses. These were trained federal law enforcement officers, people whose jobs required accurate observation and factual reporting. They had no reason to fabricate stories, and indeed, most of them had never officially reported their experiences, fearing ridicule or negative career consequences. But in private conversations, away from official channels, they shared their encounters, seeking not explanations, but simply acknowledgement that they were not alone in having witnessed something extraordinary. The scientific community, when it addressed such phenomena at all, typically attributed them to misidentified conventional objects or natural phenomena. Venus seen through atmospheric distortion, Chinese lanterns released during celebrations, military flares conducting training exercises, research aircraft testing new propulsion systems, ball lightning or other rare atmospheric electrical effects. Each explanation had merit in specific cases, but none seemed to adequately account for the full range of observed behaviors, particularly the apparent ability to move against prevailing winds and accelerate instantaneously. Some researchers suggested that the proximity to the border itself might be relevant. The region is a zone of intense human activity, emotion, and often tragedy. Thousands of migrants have perished attempting to cross the desert, their deaths frequently going undocumented, their remains sometimes never recovered. Could there be some connection between this concentration of human suffering and the appearance of unexplained phenomena? The idea seemed far-fetched, belonging more to folklore than science. Yet it persisted in local oral traditions on both sides of the border. The Mexican perspective on these lights was somewhat different from the American one. In the towns and villages south of the border, the lights were often incorporated into existing systems of belief and understanding. Some saw them as manifestations of La Llorona, the weeping woman of legend who wanders seeking her lost children. Others identified them with pre-Columbian spiritual traditions, spirits of the ancient peoples who had inhabited these lands long before any political boundaries were drawn. Still others took a more pragmatic view, seeing the lights as warnings, natural signs that indicated when conditions in the desert were particularly dangerous for crossing. Ramirez found himself changed by his experience, not in any dramatic way, not in a manner that interfered with his ability to do his job, but subtly, fundamentally. He had always believed in the solidity of the physical world, in the reliability of cause and effect, in the ability of human understanding to eventually explain any phenomenon given enough time and investigation. Now he was less certain. He had encountered something that resisted explanation, that seemed to exist at the edges of what was considered possible, and he knew, with the certainty that comes from direct experience, that he had not imagined it, had not misperceived some mundane occurrence, had not been the victim of any hoax or delusion. The official stance of the Border Patrol remained carefully neutral. The incident was documented. The video evidence was preserved, but no conclusions were drawn, no official explanation offered. This was perhaps the most prudent approach, given the lack of definitive evidence pointing to any specific cause. Yet it also left those who had witnessed the phenomenon in a kind of limbo, validated by the acknowledgement that something had occurred, but without any framework for understanding what that something had been.